Albert Camus was 29 years old when he decided that the most urgent question in all of philosophy was not whether God exists, not whether knowledge is possible, not even whether life has meaning. It was simpler and more brutal than any of that. He wanted to know why more people don't kill themselves, not as a provocation, as a genuine, careful question. If a person looks honestly at their situation, at a universe that offers no answer to why any of this is happening, at a life that will end regardless of what they achieve inside it, the fact that most people keep getting up in the morning starts to look less like an obvious default and more like something that actually needs explaining. Most of us assume the search for meaning is the whole task of a life. Find your purpose, find your calling, find the thing that makes it all make sense, and the anxiety will finally lift. Camus thought this search was not the solution. He thought it was the problem, and that most people spend their entire lives running from the one honest answer sitting underneath it. By the end of this video, you will understand what Camus actually meant by the absurd, why he thought the two most common responses to it are both a kind of quiet surrender, and what he proposed instead, which is stranger, harder, and far more alive than either despair or false comfort. Let's get into it. Start with the feeling itself, because Camus was precise about where it comes from. It is not sadness, and it is not really about any specific disappointment. It shows up, he wrote, in the sudden strangeness of a familiar gesture repeated for the 1,000th time. The way an ordinary Tuesday can suddenly feel unbearably arbitrary, as if you had woken up mid-sentence in a story that was never actually being told to anyone. You go to work, you come home, you eat, you sleep, and one day, the question arrives from nowhere. Why? Not why this particular thing happened, but why any of it. The whole sequence, the entire structure of getting up and doing it again. Camus called this the confrontation with the absurd, and his claim about it was oddly narrow and easy to miss on a first read. The absurd is not a property of the universe alone, and it is not a property of the human mind alone. It is the relationship between the two. A universe that is simply silent, offering no built-in answer to why anything matters, meeting a mind that cannot stop demanding one. So where does that leave a person once they actually notice this? Camus thought there were exactly two tempting exits, and that almost everyone takes one of them without fully realizing it. The first exit is the literal one, actual suicide, and Camus took it seriously enough to open his most famous essay with it. He did not treat it as a scandalous provocation. He treated it as the honest response of someone who has correctly diagnosed the absurd, and concluded that if life has no built-in justification, it is not worth continuing. His entire argument exists to explain why he thought this conclusion, however logically tempting, was actually a mistake, and a specific kind of mistake. It resolves the tension by eliminating one side of it. No more mind demanding an answer, so no more absurd. But it does this by destroying the very thing that was doing the demanding, which Camus considered a kind of intellectual defeat disguised as clarity. The second exit is quieter and far more common, and Camus gave it a name that still sounds strange today. He called it philosophical suicide. This is not ending your life, it is ending the honest confrontation with the question, while continuing to live, by manufacturing an answer that was never actually earned. A religious system that promises the universe secretly does have a plan, even though nothing in direct experience confirms it. An ideology that promises history is moving towards some guaranteed redemption. A self-help framework that promises your specific suffering is secretly meaningful if you just reframe it correctly. Camus was not attacking faith itself, and it matters that we get this right. He was attacking the move of using an unproven answer to make the original question stop hurting, the way a person might swallow a story whole simply because the alternative, sitting with no story at all, felt unbearable. Here is the part that tends to surprise people who assume Camus was simply a gloomy nihilist. He thought both of these exits, literal suicide and philosophical suicide, were forms of surrender, and he thought the entire nihilist reading of his work, the idea that if nothing has built-in meaning, then nothing matters and anything goes, was a serious misunderstanding of what he was actually proposing. Nihilism, in Camus' account, was not the conclusion of taking the absurd seriously. It was one more way of flinching from it, just with a shrug instead of a leap. If the search for meaning is the trap, then declaring that nothing matters is simply the trap's mirror image, an equally premature way of ending a question you were supposed to keep living inside of. So what was actually left if you refuse both the leap and the shrug? This is the turn the entire argument depends on, and it is worth sitting with slowly, because it is easy to rush past. Camus' answer was revolt, not political rebellion, though it later grew into that in his other work. Something closer to a permanent, clear-eyed refusal to either kill the question or fake an answer to it. You keep the absurd fully in view, the universe's silence on one side, your mind's demand for meaning on the other, and instead of collapsing that tension in either direction, you live directly inside it, without appeal, without consolation, and this is the part that tends to land hardest, without despair either. There is no rescue coming, and Camus wanted you to feel the full weight of that sentence before he told you what to do with it. This is where his most famous image does its actual work, rather than functioning as decoration. Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, watching it roll back down every single time, forever, with no possibility of the task ever being finished or justified. Most retellings stop at the punishment. Camus was interested in the walk back down the mountain, the brief interval after the boulder has rolled away and before the next push begins, because that is the moment Sisyphus is fully conscious of his condition, with nothing yet demanding his attention. Camus insisted that this consciousness, rather than being the worst part of the punishment, was the exact thing that could make Sisyphus superior to his fate, rather than crushed by it. He wrote, in the line that closes the entire essay, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. That sentence is not a trick or a consolation prize. Camus was not saying the boulder secretly has meaning if you squint at it correctly, which would just be philosophical suicide again, wearing a stoic costume. He was saying something closer to this. The moment you stop expecting the boulder to justify itself, you are free to actually experience pushing it, the strain in your own arms, the specific quality of this mountain's light, the plain fact of still being the one doing the pushing. The absurdity of the task does not disappear. What disappears is your dependence on the task having a point before you're willing to fully inhabit it. It is worth pausing here to name a real limitation in this idea, because Camus himself never treated it as a complete answer to suffering, and pretending otherwise would flatten something he took seriously. Revolt, as Camus describes it, works cleanly for existential suffering, the vertigo of meaninglessness itself. It is a considerably harder sell to someone in the middle of acute physical pain, grief, or poverty, where the immediate problem is not an abstract lack of cosmic justification, but a concrete, urgent need that no amount of lucid attention to the present moment actually relieves. Telling someone in the depths of a genuine crisis to imagine Sisyphus happy risks sounding, at best, tone-deaf, and at worst, like the same kind of premature resolution Camus was trying to avoid, just dressed in his own vocabulary instead of a religious one. Camus' later work, particularly on rebellion and solidarity, was in part his own attempt to push this idea further, from a philosophy of one person's private clarity towards something that could hold other people's suffering too, an ethics built out of the recognition that if the absurd condition is shared by everyone, then revolt on your own behalf quietly implies a kind of revolt on behalf of others as well. It is fair to say the early absurdist writing, on its own, does not fully answer the harder case, and a serious account of this idea should say so, rather than pretend the boulder metaphor solves every kind of pain equally well. None of this was ever a promise to remove the pain. Camus was not offering an exit from suffering, only a different posture inside it, a way of carrying the weight without either dropping it through a story that isn't true or pretending the weight isn't there at all. The pain stays exactly as heavy. What changes, if revolt actually takes hold, is who is doing the carrying and how awake they are while they do it. There is a modern version of both exits that Camus never had to describe because the machinery for it did not exist in his lifetime, and naming it changes how the whole idea lands today. The literal exit still exists, quieter and more common than most people want to admit, but the philosophical suicide exit has been industrialized. An entire economy now exists to sell you a manufactured why, a 5-step framework promising your job is actually your calling, a wellness account promising the universe rearranges itself around people who think positively enough, an algorithm feeding you a curated stream of other people's apparently meaningful lives so convincingly that your own ordinary Tuesday starts to look like the anomaly rather than the norm. None of this looks like religion, which is exactly what makes it effective. It is philosophical suicide with better production values, the leap dressed up as content. There is a rough way to tell the difference between something that genuinely helps a person live with the absurd and something that is quietly performing the leap for them. Real revolt, in Camus's sense, tends to survive contact with a bad week. It does not require the universe to keep confirming it in order to remain intact. A manufactured why behaves differently under pressure. The moment life produces a disconfirming event, a diagnosis with no lesson in it, a loss that teaches nothing, the belief does not adjust to the new information. It works harder to explain the information away, because unlike revolt, it was never built to withstand contact with something that simply refuses to mean anything. Ask yourself honestly, the next time a piece of advice promises to finally make your life make sense, whether it is actually answering the question or simply making it stop being audible for a while. Camus would have wanted you to notice the difference, because only one of them is revolt, and the other one is just a more comfortable version of the leap he spent his whole essay warning against. Consider what this actually looks like in an ordinary life, rather than in the abstract. A woman in her early 30s feels the absurd arrive during an unremarkable commute, on a gray Tuesday, fluorescent light overhead, the same route she has taken hundreds of times, past the same billboard, the same coffee shop with its handwritten sign. Nothing has gone wrong that morning. That is precisely what makes the feeling so disorienting. The sudden vertiginous sense arrives that the entire structure of her week, the meetings, the errands, the small rituals that used to feel automatic, the specific rhythm of her own footsteps on the same stretch of pavement, has no more justification than any other arrangement of ours would. She does not act on it dramatically. She goes looking instead for something to make the feeling stop. Within a year, she has found it, a wellness framework that reorganizes her entire understanding of her life around the idea that everything happening to her is secretly preparing her for something larger, that the discomfort itself is proof a bigger design is underway. She keeps a journal now, color-coded, tracking which discomforts turned out to be lessons. The vertigo lifts almost immediately. For a while, this looks like the story has a happy ending. What Camus would have wanted her to notice, and what she does eventually notice herself, years later, standing in the same fluorescent-lit hallway on another gray Tuesday, is how much upkeep the belief requires to keep functioning. Every disconfirming piece of evidence, a friend's unrelated tragedy, a plan that collapses for no discernible reason, has to be quietly explained away or reframed, entered into the color-coded journal with an increasingly strained caption, and the explaining takes more effort each year, not less. The framework was never load-bearing in the way it first appeared to be. It was philosophical suicide, performed patiently, one reasonable-sounding reframe at a time, and it worked for exactly as long as she did not look directly at its foundation. Here is the reframe that tends to catch people off guard, and it belongs at the center of this whole idea, rather than at the edges of it. Camus is usually filed under meaninglessness, as though his entire philosophy amounts to the announcement that nothing matters. That is close to the opposite of what he was actually arguing. The absurd, taken seriously and lived inside rather than escaped, does not empty life of value. It is the only way Camus thought a person could arrive at value that was actually theirs, rather than borrowed from a system, a religion, an ideology, or a 5-step plan that promised to do the work of living for them. Meaninglessness was never the destination in his philosophy. It was the clearing operation that had to happen first, so that whatever you chose to care about afterward would be chosen, rather than merely inherited. This is why Revolt, in Camus' account, produces something that looks almost like its opposite from the outside. Not despair, but an intensified attachment to the world exactly as it is. The specific texture of a particular afternoon, a friendship, a piece of work done well for no further reason than doing it well. He described this attachment as a form of passion, and he meant that precisely. Once you stop demanding that experience justify itself with a guarantee about tomorrow, you are free to actually notice today. The absurd hero, in his account, is not someone gritting their teeth through meaninglessness. It is someone who has become almost unreasonably present, because presence was the only thing on offer once the guarantees were gone. There is a genuine cost to skipping this and reaching for one of the 2 exits instead, and it is worth naming plainly rather than letting the philosophy stay abstract. Someone who takes the philosophical suicide exit tends to build an entire life around a borrowed answer that quietly requires more and more maintenance to keep believing, more curation, more avoidance of any evidence that might contradict it, more anger at anyone who questions it, because the foundation was never actually load-bearing to begin with. Someone who takes the nihilist shrug instead pays a different, quieter price. It rarely announces itself as despair. It shows up as a kind of low-grade detachment from your own choices, a habit of undercutting anything that starts to matter to you before it gets the chance to matter too much, treating enthusiasm itself as slightly embarrassing, as though caring visibly about something were evidence of not having gotten the joke everyone else supposedly already got. Camus thought this posture, often mistaken for sophistication, was simply the same flinch, performed with less effort and better lighting. Ask yourself honestly which exit you have been quietly leaning on. Not as an accusation, but as the same kind of clear look Camus was asking of Sisyphus on his walk back down the mountain. Is there a story you have been telling yourself about why your specific life has to add up to something? A story that, if you are honest, you adopted because sitting without it felt unbearable, rather than because anything actually confirmed it? Or have you gone the other direction, decided that since nothing has a built-in guarantee, none of your choices are worth caring about particularly, using that as a quiet excuse to stop trying at anything, to stop being disappointed because you were never really invested to begin with? Most people, asked this plainly rather than rhetorically, can locate which exit they favor faster than they expect. It tends to be the one that shows up automatically whenever something in life genuinely disappoints them. The reflex reach for either a bigger story that makes the disappointment mean something, or a shrug that makes it mean nothing at all, rather than the harder, plainer option of simply staying with it exactly as it is. Neither of those is Revolt. Revolt is harder than both, and considerably less comfortable, which is probably why it remains the least popular of the 3 options centuries of readers have taken from this essay. It asks you to keep the question fully open, permanently, and to keep living with full attention anyway, not because you have finally solved it, but because solving it was never actually the assignment. That is the real image this idea leaves you with, and it is worth holding on to more than the philosophical machinery underneath it. Not a man crushed by an eternal, pointless task, and not a man who has tricked himself into believing the task secretly has meaning. A man who has stopped waiting for the boulder to answer him, and who has, in exchange, become fully available to the walk back down the mountain, one particular afternoon, entirely his own, asking nothing of him in return. If this way of thinking about meaning and the absurd is useful to you, subscribe for more of it. Until the next video.